Nathan Bedford Forrest was born on July 13, 1821, in a primitive log cabin near Chapel Hill, Tennessee, in what was then Bedford County. He arrived in the world alongside a twin sister named Fanny, and they were the eldest of what would eventually become 12 children. His father, William Forrest, was a blacksmith who struggled to scratch out a living for his growing family in the Tennessee backwoods. His mother, Miriam Beck, came from equally humble circumstances. The Forrest family represented the hardscrabble existence of poor white settlers in the antebellum South, people who owned no slaves and possessed little formal education. Young Nathan received almost no schooling. Throughout his life, he could barely read and write, and his spelling remained phonetic at best. The frontier communities of early 19th century Tennessee offered little in the way of formal education, and families like the Forrests needed every able body working to survive. But what he lacked in education, he made up for in physical presence and raw determination. He grew to stand 6 feet to 2 inches tall, an imposing height for that era, and developed a powerful frame that would serve him well in the violent world he would inhabit. Those who knew him described a man with a commanding presence, someone who could intimidate through sheer physical force of personality. He rarely drank alcohol and abstained from tobacco, unusual habits for a Southern man of his time, and was known as a tireless rider who could outlast any horse and any opponent. The Forrest family's circumstances grew even more desperate when Nathan was 13 years old. In 1834, the family relocated to Tippah County in northern Mississippi, hoping for better opportunities. 3 years later, tragedy struck. William Forrest died from the lingering effects of typhoid fever, leaving 17-year-old Nathan as the head of a household that included his widowed mother and 7 surviving siblings. Several of his brothers and sisters, including his twin Fanny, had already died from typhoid fever, and Nathan himself had contracted the disease, but survived. This early experience of loss and responsibility shaped the man Forrest would become. He threw himself into providing for his family with the same intensity he would later bring to the battlefield. He worked the family farm, raised livestock, and traded horses and cattle. Through relentless effort and natural business instincts, he pulled his family out of poverty. By his early 20s, he had accumulated enough capital to strike out on his own. In 1841, Forrest entered a business partnership with his uncle Jonathan in Hernando, Mississippi. The venture combined a livery stable operation with livestock trading, and young Nathan proved himself an able businessman. But this period also revealed another side of his character. In 1845, an argument between his uncle and a group of brothers named Matlock turned violent. Jonathan Forrest was killed in the A.A. dispute. Nathan responded with fury, shooting 2 of the Matlock brothers dead with his 2-shot pistol and wounding 2 others with a knife that had been thrown to him. This was perhaps the first demonstration of the lethal temper and capacity for violence that would define his later career. One of the surviving Matlock brothers would actually serve under Forrest's command during the Civil War. That same year of 1845, just 6 weeks after meeting her, Forrest married Mary Ann Montgomery, the niece of a Presbyterian minister. The couple would have 2 children, a son named William Montgomery Bedford Forrest, and a daughter named Fanny, who died in childhood. The marriage to Mary Ann represented an upward move in social standing, connecting Forrest to more established families. By the late 1840s, Forrest had identified where the real money lay in the Deep South. Cotton was king, and cotton required labor. Enslaved labor. Forrest moved to Memphis around 1852 and entered the slave trade with a ruthlessness and business acumen that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the South within a decade. Memphis in the 1850s was emerging as a major hub for the domestic slave trade. Its location on the Mississippi River, combined with the recently completed Memphis and Charleston Railroad, made it an ideal marketplace for the buying and selling of human beings. Adams Street, running from the riverfront steamboat landing to the railroad depot, became the center of this commerce. Enslaved people were brought into the city from the Upper South, states like Virginia, Kentucky, and Maryland, where the cotton economy was less dominant, and then sold onward to cotton plantations in the Mississippi Delta and further into the Deep South. The demand seemed endless as cotton cultivation spread westward, and prices rose steadily throughout the decade. It was a lucrative and expanding business, and Forrest threw himself into it completely, showing the same aggressive business instincts that had helped him rise from poverty. In 1854, Forrest purchased property at 87 Adams Street in downtown Memphis and established his slave yard. He built what he himself called a slave jail, a facility designed to hold hundreds of people awaiting sale. A survivor named Horatio Eden, who was sold from Forrest's yard as a child along with his mother and siblings, later described the facility as a square stockade of high boards with two-room houses around three sides and a fence too high to climb on the fourth side. When auctions were held or buyers came, the enslaved people were brought out and paraded around a circular brick walk in the center of the stockade. Buyers would stand nearby and inspect them as they passed, stopping them for closer examination. The scale of Forrest's operation was immense. Historians estimate that during the 6 years he operated his Memphis slave market, from 1854 to 1860, Forrest sold approximately 7,500 people. An advertisement in the Memphis City Directory from the mid-1850s promoted his business, boasting of 50 likely young Negroes comprising field hands, mechanics, and body servants, along with a jail large enough to hold 300 people. By 1860, the city directory listed 10 slave dealers in Memphis, with 6 of them located on Adams Street. Forrest was considered one of the big 4 phenomenally large traders in the city. The profits were staggering. Based on an average price of $900 per person and typical profit margins, Forrest's slave trading operation generated net profits exceeding $1 million in 1850s currency. This would be equivalent to tens of millions in today's money. An 1858 Memphis newspaper described him as one of the wealthiest citizens of the entire South. But Forrest did not merely follow the rules of this brutal trade. He broke them. In 1859, a federal investigation found that Forrest had sold 37 individuals who had been illegally imported to the United States from Africa on the slave ship Wanderer. Congress had banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, making the importation of enslaved Africans a federal crime. Yet Forrest openly sold people described as direct from the Congo at his yard. In a later interview, Forrest even admitted that he had been an initial investor in the Wanderer shipment. He advocated publicly for reopening the transatlantic slave trade. The personal testimonies of those who passed through Forrest's operation reveal the horror of his business. Lewis Hughes, who published a memoir after emancipation, recounted how his wife's family was brought to the trader's yard of Nathan Bedford Forrest when they arrived in Memphis. None of this family were sold to the same person except my wife and one sister, Hughes wrote. All the rest were sold to separate persons. Samuel Hall, another survivor, recalled in his 1912 memoir that Forrest kept a slave trader yard in Memphis, and I knew him well. He would buy up slaves and keep them in this yard and sell them like people sell hogs today. Reports also emerged of brutal treatment within the slave yard. An 1864 article in northern newspapers described whippings conducted by Forrest and his brother John, the use of a torture called salting, and the secret burial of an enslaved man who had been whipped to death with a trace chain, doubled for the purpose of punishment. All of Forrest's younger brothers worked as slave traders with him before the war. In January 1860, the three-story building housing Forrest, Jones and Company's slave operation collapsed and caught fire. 2 people died in the disaster, enslaved people who were being held for sale. The firm's bills of sale for enslaved people, totaling $400,000, a staggering sum equivalent to nearly $14 million today, were salvaged from the wreckage. Forrest had recently expanded his operation, moving from 87 Adams Street to 89 Adams Street, which allowed him to increase his holding capacity from a maximum of 300 enslaved people to 500. Shortly after this catastrophe, Forrest sold his interest in the slave trading business and reinvested the profits into cotton plantations. By 1860, he owned at least 3,000 acres in Mississippi's Coahoma County alone, along with additional holdings in Tennessee and Arkansas. Federal census records from 1860 document dozens of enslaved people laboring on his Mississippi properties. By the time the Civil War erupted in April 1861, Nathan Bedford Forrest had amassed a personal fortune he claimed was worth $1.5 million. He was one of the wealthiest men in the entire South, a self-made millionaire who had risen from frontier poverty through the trafficking of human beings. And when his adopted region chose to secede from the Union, rather than accept any limitations on the institution of slavery, Forrest was ready to fight. On June 14, 1861, Forrest enlisted in the Confederate Army as a private in Captain Josiah White's Tennessee Mounted Rifles. He was 40 years old, with no military training whatsoever. His youngest brother Jesse and his 15-year-old son William enlisted alongside him. But Forrest had no intention of remaining a private for long. When he saw how badly equipped the Confederate forces were, he offered to buy horses and equipment with his own money for an entire regiment of Tennessee volunteer soldiers. Tennessee's Governor Isham Harris was surprised that someone of Forrest's wealth and prominence had enlisted at all, particularly since significant planters were exempt from military service. Forrest was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel and posted recruitment advertisements that captured his aggressive spirit. "I wish none but those who desire to be actively engaged," the notice read. "Come on, boys, if you want a heap of fun, and to kill some Yankees." Forrest first distinguished himself at the Battle of Fort Donelson in February 1862. When Union forces under Ulysses Grant surrounded the fort, and Confederate generals decided to surrender the massive garrison, Forrest was furious. "I did not come here to surrender my command," he declared. While nearly 15,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms, Forrest led a cavalry charge against a Union artillery battery, captured it, and then guided nearly 4,000 troops through the snow to escape across the Cumberland River. A month later, with Nashville about to fall to Union forces, Forrest took command of the city and organized an evacuation that saved critical Confederate resources. He arranged for the transport of 600 boxes of Army clothing, 250,000 pounds of bacon, 40 wagon loads of ammunition, heavy ordnance machinery including a new cannon rifling machine and 14 cannons, and parts from the Nashville Armory to be sent to Atlanta and other Confederate facilities. This was equipment the Confederacy could ill afford to lose. At the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, Forrest again demonstrated his aggressive tactics and apparent fearlessness. During the Confederate retreat, he led a rearguard action against pursuing Union forces. When a Union infantryman shot him through the pelvis at point-blank range, with the ball lodging near his spine, Forrest stayed in the saddle. He reached down, grabbed his attacker by the shirt collar, lifted the man onto his horse, and used him as a human shield until he was out of range of further fire. Then he cast the Union soldier aside and continued commanding his troops. This wound kept Forrest out of action for only about a month. He was back in the saddle by summer, leading a new brigade of raw cavalry recruits. In July 1862, on his birthday, Forrest led these inexperienced troops in a raid on the Union-held city of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, he captured the entire Union garrison. It was just the first of many victories Forrest would win against superior forces. Forrest's tactics were unconventional and revolutionary for the era. While traditional cavalry operated as mounted units charging with sabers in the Napoleonic style, Forrest used his men as mounted infantry. They would ride quickly to a strategic location, dismount, fight on foot with rifles and carbines, then remount and ride to another position before the enemy could react. This gave his forces mobility far exceeding that of standard infantry, while maintaining the firepower of foot soldiers. He also deployed artillery aggressively, leading with cannons rather than holding them in reserve as was conventional doctrine. Military historians credit him with helping to revolutionize cavalry tactics, pioneering concepts that would later be called mobile warfare, and that foreshadowed the use of mechanized forces in the 20th century. His most quoted maxim, often rendered in dialect as "Git thar fustest with the mostest," captured his philosophy of war. War means fighting, and fighting means killing, he declared. Speed, aggression, and the element of surprise were his weapons. During the Battle of Paducah, his 2,500-man cavalry rode 100 miles in just 50 hours. No Union commander could pin him down. Throughout late 1862 and 1863, Forrest's cavalry harassed Union General Grant's operations around Vicksburg, cutting supply lines, raiding depots, and forcing the diversion of troops that might otherwise have been used in the siege. Some historians argue that Forrest's raids delayed the fall of Vicksburg by several months. On New Year's Eve 1862, at Parker's Crossroads, when a Union force suddenly appeared in his rear and threatened to surround him, Forrest famously ordered his men to charge both ways. They did, and escaped the trap. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who would become one of the war's most formidable Union commanders, recognized Forrest as a uniquely dangerous adversary. "That devil Forrest must be hunted down and killed," Sherman declared. In 1864, if it costs 10,000 lives and bankrupts the federal treasury. But April 1864 would bring the event that most stained Forrest's military reputation. On April 12th, the third anniversary of the firing on Fort Sumter that had started the Civil War, Forrest led approximately 1,500 Confederate troops against Fort Pillow, a Union-held fortification on the Mississippi River about 40 miles north of Memphis. The garrison at Fort Pillow was small, about 567 men. Roughly half were black soldiers from the 6th United States Colored Heavy Artillery and the 2nd United States Colored Light Artillery. The rest were white troops from the 13th Tennessee Cavalry, many of them Southern Unionists and Confederate deserters. The presence of black soldiers in Union uniform enraged Confederate troops throughout the South. The Confederacy had passed a law in 1863 stating that black soldiers captured while fighting against the Confederacy would be turned over to states to be tried as slave insurrectionists, effectively making their capture an automatic death sentence. Forrest's forces quickly surrounded the fort and drove off a Union gunboat that had been providing support. By early afternoon, the Confederates had gained superior positions around the fortification. At around 3:30 p.m., Forrest demanded the garrison's surrender. Major William Bradford, who had taken command after the fort's original commander was killed by a sniper, asked for an hour to consult. Forrest granted 20 minutes. Bradford refused to surrender. What happened next remains one of the most controversial events of the Civil War. The Confederates stormed the fort and quickly overwhelmed the defenders. Union soldiers, many of them attempting to surrender, were driven down the river bluff into a deadly crossfire. Eyewitness accounts from Union survivors stated that Confederate soldiers murdered prisoners, including wounded men, after the fort had been taken. Even some Confederate soldiers acknowledged a slaughter took place. One Confederate soldier wrote home describing what he called the most terrible ordeal of my whole life, telling his family how Forrest had ordered black men shot down like dogs. The casualty figures tell a stark story. Nearly 300 Union soldiers were killed, while Confederate losses numbered only 14 dead and 86 wounded. Of the approximately 300 black troops at Fort Pillow, only 58 survived to be captured. While 70% of the white Union soldiers survived, only 35% of the black soldiers survived. A congressional investigation found that most wounds suffered by Union soldiers were to the head and torso, suggesting executions rather than battle wounds, which typically occur to the limbs. Forrest himself wrote in his initial report to his superior that the river was dyed with the blood of the slaughtered for 200 yards. It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the Northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners. His second report omitted these inflammatory remarks. General Grant quoted Forrest's dispatch in his personal memoirs and commented that subsequently Forrest made a report in which he left out the part which shocks humanity to read. The Fort Pillow Massacre, as it became known, outraged the North. Remember, Fort Pillow became a rallying cry for black Union soldiers throughout the remaining year of the war. The massacre transformed what might have been a minor engagement into a symbol of Confederate brutality, and steeled the resolve of black troops who now understood they could expect no mercy if captured. President Lincoln had already issued an order of retaliation, threatening that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. While this threat was never carried out, the massacre hardened Northern resolve and contributed to the Union's refusal to participate in prisoner exchanges. Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon had written in June 1864 that he doubted whether the exchange of Negroes at all for our soldiers would be tolerated, making clear that the Confederacy did not intend to treat black prisoners as legitimate soldiers regardless of Union demands. Defenders of Forrest then and now argue that he did not directly order the massacre and that he attempted to stop the killing once he became aware of it. But whatever his personal role in the violence, the troops under his command committed what military historian David Eicher called one of the bleakest, saddest events of American military history. The responsibility for the actions of those troops lay with their commander. Just 2 months after Fort Pillow, Forrest achieved what many consider his most impressive tactical victory at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads in Mississippi on June 10, 1864. Sherman had dispatched Brigadier General Samuel Sturgis with over 8,000 men to hunt down Forrest and prevent him from attacking Union supply lines supporting Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Forrest had fewer than half that number. But Forrest understood his enemy and the terrain. He knew that Sturgis's cavalry would reach the crossroads first, followed by infantry that would have to march through oppressive heat on muddy roads. As soon as the fight opens, Forrest told his officers, they will send back to have the infantry hurried up. It is going to be hot as hell, and coming on a run for 5 or 6 miles over such roads, their infantry will be so tired we will ride right over them. That is exactly what happened. Forrest engaged the Union cavalry first, using aggressive tactics to pin them in place while preventing them from maneuvering around his flanks. The dense underbrush and thickets of northern Mississippi helped mask the fact that his forces were outnumbered. When the exhausted Union infantry arrived after a grueling march through oppressive heat and muddy roads, many of them collapsing from heat exhaustion before they even reached the battlefield, Forrest's forces swept around their flanks and shattered their lines. The Union force disintegrated into a panicked rout. Union casualties totaled 2,500 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with the loss of 16 artillery pieces, 170 wagons, and all their supplies. Forrest's losses were fewer than 500. The Confederate cavalry pursued the fleeing Union forces for 65 miles over the next 3 days, capturing additional men and equipment at every opportunity. Military academies still study Bryce's Crossroads as an example of tactical brilliance. The battle demonstrated all 9 principles of war that modern military doctrine emphasizes, including objective, offensive, mass, economy of force, maneuver, unity of command, security, surprise, and simplicity. Forrest had no formal military education, yet he executed a textbook example of combined arms warfare against a numerically superior enemy. Forrest continued fighting until the very end of the war. In September 1863, he played a significant role at the Battle of Chickamauga, where his cavalry held the Confederate right flank and then pursued the retreating Union Army into Chattanooga, taking hundreds of prisoners. After that battle, he openly criticized General Braxton Bragg for failing to capitalize on the Confederate victory, a confrontation that led to his transfer to independent command in Mississippi. In December 1863, he was promoted to Major General. His raids continued throughout 1864, including a daring assault on Memphis itself that summer, when he led troops into the heart of the Union-occupied city. In February 1865, he was promoted to Lieutenant General, the only soldier on either side to rise from private to that rank without formal military training. He had 29 horses shot out from under him during the war, was wounded 4 times, and reportedly killed or seriously wounded at least 30 enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. In one famous incident, a subordinate officer named Lieutenant Andrew Gould attempted to assassinate Forrest during a dispute. Forrest killed Gould with his penknife while suffering wounds of his own. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox in April 1865, Forrest surrendered as well. Any man who is in favor of a further prosecution of this war is a fit subject for a lunatic asylum, he declared. In his farewell address to his troops, he urged them to divest themselves of feelings of animosity, hatred, and revenge, and to cultivate friendly feelings towards those with whom we have so long contended. It was advice he himself would struggle to follow. The end of the Civil War brought financial ruin to Nathan Bedford Forrest. The source of his wealth, the institution of slavery, had been abolished by the 13th Amendment. Confederate currency was worthless. His plantations were devastated by years of war and the disruption of the labor system on which they depended. The $4 million in human property he had once claimed was now nothing, the people he had owned now free. The man who had been worth $1.5 million before the war found himself nearly bankrupt, forced to rebuild from almost nothing. But Forrest was not content to simply rebuild his personal fortunes. The social order that had made his wealth possible had been overturned. The 4 million people who had been enslaved were now free, and the federal government was implementing Reconstruction policies that included voting rights for black men. For Forrest and men like him, this represented an existential threat to everything they believed in. In 1866, 6 Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed a social club they called the Ku Klux Klan. What began as pranks and midnight rides in ghostly costumes quickly transformed into something far more sinister as the organization spread throughout the South. The Klan became a vehicle for violent resistance to Reconstruction and to black political participation. Nathan Bedford Forrest became involved with the Klan sometime in late 1866 or early 1867. According to multiple accounts, he was sworn in as a member at the Maxwell House Hotel in Nashville by John Morton, who had served under him during the war. The organization had grown to the point that an experienced commander was needed, and Forrest was well suited to the role. In April 1867, at what was essentially the Klan's first national convention, Forrest was acclaimed as the first Grand Wizard. The title was chosen because Forrest had been known as the Wizard of the Saddle during the war. Now he would lead a different kind of campaign. In an 1868 newspaper interview, Forrest boasted that the Klan had 40,000 members in Tennessee and 550,000 total throughout the South. He claimed he could muster 40,000 Klansmen with only 5 days' notice. When asked about the organization's purpose, Forrest played down the violence. He claimed the Klan did not see blacks as its enemy so much as carpetbaggers and scalawags, Northern newcomers and white Southern Republicans. But upon learning of the Klan and its purposes, Forrest had reportedly remarked, "That's a good thing. That's a damn good thing. We can use that to keep the niggers in their place." Under Forrest's leadership, the Klan launched a campaign of terror across the South. Politically active black people and their white allies were threatened, assaulted, and murdered. Klan members conducted midnight parades and ghost masquerades, appearing at the homes of black families and Republican organizers in bizarre costumes designed to frighten and intimidate. They whipped and killed black voters and white Republicans to scare blacks off voting and running for office. The violence was particularly intense during the 1868 elections, as the Klan worked systematically to prevent black men from exercising their newly won right to vote. Schools that educated black children were burned to the ground. Northern teachers who had come south to establish freedmen's schools were whipped, lynched, or driven away. In Tennessee alone, the violence suppressed Republican voting enough to affect election outcomes, though it could not entirely reverse the political changes brought by Reconstruction. In 1869, apparently disillusioned with the organization's lack of discipline and the independence of local chapters, Forrest ordered the Klan disbanded and its costumes destroyed. Many local chapters ignored the order and continued to operate. Forrest withdrew from active involvement, though how complete his separation was remains disputed. When called to testify before a congressional committee investigating Klan activities in 1871, Forrest denied ever being a member of the organization. His testimony was evasive and contradictory. After the hearing, he reportedly admitted to gentlemanly lies, saying he wanted nothing more to do with the Klan, but felt honor-bound to protect former associates. The investigating committee noted dryly that the reader may form his own conclusion upon this question of whether Forrest had been the Klan's leader. The passage of the Enforcement Acts from 1870 to 1871 gave the federal government tools to prosecute Klan violence. President Grant and the newly formed Department of Justice secured over 5,000 indictments and 1,000 convictions of Klan members. The first incarnation of the Klan was effectively crushed by federal action. Meanwhile, Forrest pursued business ventures with considerably less success than he had shown in slave trading. He became president of the Selma, Marion, and Memphis Railroad, hoping to capitalize on the rebuilding of Southern infrastructure. But he was not as successful in railroad promotion as in war, and under his direction the company went bankrupt in the early 1870s amidst the nationwide financial collapse of the Panic of 1873. Nearly ruined by the railroad failure, Forrest spent his final years running a prison work farm on President's Island in the Mississippi River near Memphis. There, on 800 leased acres, he and his wife lived in a log cabin, while he oversaw the labor of over 100 prison convicts, most of them black. The convicts grew corn, potatoes, vegetables, and cotton. In May 1877, a contemporary account described Forrest's use of convict labor as indistinguishable from slavery, noting the use of bloodhounds, shotgun-wielding guards, and corporal punishment. The former slave trader had found a new way to profit from coerced black labor within the post-slavery legal system. In his final years, Forrest's health declined sharply. Diabetes ravaged his body. He lost weight until he weighed less than 100 pounds. In July 1875, Forrest made a speech to the Independent Order of Pole Bearers Association, an organization of former slaves that was a precursor to the NAACP. It was the first time a prominent white man had addressed the group. He expressed the opinion that blacks had the right to vote for any candidates they wanted, and that their role should be elevated. He reportedly ended the speech by kissing the cheek of a young black woman who had presented him with flowers. Some have pointed to this speech as evidence of changed views. Others note that whatever personal evolution Forrest may have experienced could not undo the harm he had already caused. Nathan Bedford Forrest died on October 29, 1877 at the age of 56, at the Memphis home of his brother Jesse. His health had been in steep decline for months. His funeral procession stretched over 2 miles long, and an estimated 20,000 people attended. Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, delivered a eulogy. According to one account, approximately 500 black citizens were among the mourners. The convicts who had labored on his prison farm reportedly sent a spokesman to ask after the boss, and were told he was not getting better. The spokesman reportedly said that when that man in there dies, we will have lost our best friend. Whether this story is accurate or apocryphal, it has been cited by those seeking to rehabilitate Forrest's image. Forrest was buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis with military honors. In 1904, his remains and those of his wife were moved to a prominent city park that bore his name. A bronze equestrian statue depicting Forrest on horseback was dedicated in 1905, during the height of Jim Crow segregation. The statue and the park became flashpoints for controversy for over a century. In 2013, Memphis renamed the park Health Sciences Park, removing Forrest's name. In December 2017, after the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Memphis City Council found a way around state laws protecting Confederate monuments by selling the park for $1,000 to a private nonprofit, which removed the statue that same night. In 2021, after years of legal battles, the remains of Forrest and his wife were exhumed and relocated to the Sons of Confederate Veterans headquarters in Columbia, Tennessee. The removal of Forrest's statue and remains did not end the debate over his legacy. Tennessee state law still requires the governor to sign a proclamation declaring July 13th Nathan Bedford Forrest Day, though recent governors have criticized the requirement. A bust of Forrest remained in the state capitol for years, despite calls for its removal. Schools and parks named for Forrest across the South have been gradually renamed. What are we to make of Nathan Bedford Forrest? He was undeniably a man of extraordinary abilities. Rising from frontier poverty with almost no education, he became one of the wealthiest men in the South, and then one of the most innovative military commanders of his era. His tactics are still studied in military academies. He demonstrated physical courage that even his enemies acknowledged. But those abilities were deployed in the service of human trafficking, in defense of slavery, and in the terrorization of newly freed people seeking to exercise their rights as citizens. Forrest sold approximately 7,500 human beings into bondage. He commanded troops who massacred surrendering black soldiers. He led an organization dedicated to stripping black Americans of their political rights through violence and murder. The debate over Confederate monuments often centers on questions of heritage versus hate, of honoring military valor versus glorifying white supremacy. In the case of Nathan Bedford Forrest, these distinctions collapse. He was not merely a soldier who fought for a cause that happened to include slavery. He was one of the largest slave traders in Memphis, a man who built his fortune on human suffering. He did not merely serve in the Klan, he led it at the height of its Reconstruction-era terror campaign. When that bronze statue came down in Memphis in 2017, it marked not the erasure of history, but a recognition of what that history actually contained. As Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland said at the time, the statue no longer represents who we are as a modern, diverse city with momentum. The statue had been placed in 1904 amid the passage of Jim Crow laws, and the Jefferson Davis statue removed alongside it had been erected in 1964 amid the Civil Rights Movement. These were not neutral historical markers, but assertions of white supremacy in moments when that supremacy was being challenged. Nathan Bedford Forrest represents a through line in American history that connects the slave markets of the antebellum South to the terror campaigns of Reconstruction to the ongoing struggles over race and memory in our own time. His story illuminates how wealth could be accumulated through the commodification of human beings, how military brilliance could be deployed in defense of an unjust cause, and how violence could be used to suppress the political rights of newly freed people. Understanding his full story without sanitizing or mythologizing it is essential to understanding America itself. The monuments built to honor Forrest were not erected immediately after the Civil War, but decades later, during periods when white supremacy was being reasserted through Jim Crow laws, and when civil rights movements were challenging that supremacy. The 1905 statue in Memphis went up as Tennessee was disenfranchising black voters through poll taxes and literacy tests. The movement to remove such monuments in our own time reflects not a desire to forget history, but a determination to tell it more honestly. Forrest himself understood that his legacy would be contested. In his will, he asked to be buried among the Confederate dead in Elmwood Cemetery, expressing his desire that his remains shall rest with those of the brave men who were my comrades in war, and shared with me the danger and peril of battlefields. fighting in a cause we believed it our duty to uphold. He saw himself as a soldier who had done his duty. But duty to what? The cause he fought for was the preservation of a society built on human bondage. The organization he led after the war existed to maintain white supremacy through terror. The man on the horse is gone from Memphis now, but the history he represents remains with us still. The convict labor system that Forrest exploited in his final years evolved into forms of incarceration that continue to disproportionately impact Black Americans. The voter suppression tactics pioneered by the Klan have descendants in modern efforts to restrict access to the ballot. The questions Forrest's life raises about wealth, violence, race, and memory are not historical curiosities, but urgent contemporary issues. In studying his story, we are not merely examining the past. We are trying to understand the present,